Hello, everybody. My name is Joseph Gurr, and I want to welcome you to the Five Loaves channel. I created this channel to be an outlet and just a way for my friends and I to come on here and just talk about different biblical stories or topics or really just whatever we want to talk about. I've been able to see how God has worked in my life, and I just want to use this channel as a way to spread God's word and just try and teach people more about him. So if you guys enjoy the video, make sure to like and subscribe, and also comment any biblical stories or topics that you want to see us cover. So I figured for the first episode, it'd be a good idea to cover the story that this channel is based off of, which is when Jesus feeds over 5,000 people with only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. So it's going to be in Matthew 14, verses 13 through 21. And just a little context before reading the verses. Just prior to the verses, Jesus finds out about the death of John the Baptist. And according to Luke's account, the disciples had just returned from their own missionary missions. So they had just come back from spreading the word. So Jesus wants to spend some alone time with his disciples to rest because he's grieving. One of his best friends just died, so he just wants to be alone with his best friends and just kind of relax. So if you'll join me in Matthew 14, verses 13 through 21, it says, "Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, 'This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves.' But Jesus said, 'They need not go away. You give them something to eat.' They said to him, 'We have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish.' And he said, 'Bring them here to me.' Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over, and those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children." So I think this story is really powerful because it shows us a lot of characteristics about Jesus. It shows us his compassion, it shows us his selflessness, it shows us his wisdom, and many more attributes about him. So starting in verse 13, where it says, "Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns." So, like I mentioned before, Jesus just wanted to be alone with his disciples, right? And rest and just kind of process everything that was going on. But instead, he's followed by this big crowd, right? And so this shows us how the people at the time, they needed Jesus. They had this desperate need and this hunger for what Jesus had to offer. And, it's the same way for us. Like, we should desperately need Jesus in our life. And we should hunger for the teachings that he has to offer for us. And then verse 14, it says, "When he went ashore and saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick." So here, it's talking about Jesus having compassion for these people. And he didn't just tolerate them, he didn't ignore them, but he felt this deep feeling, this deep compassion down to his soul for these people. And that just shows how much compassion that God has for us, right? If it were me, if I was just going to rest and, just kind of have alone time, and there's this big crowd of people that just keeps bugging me and asking me to do things for them, I'd be pretty upset. I'd probably tell them to come back later, or I'd tell them to leave. But instead, Jesus chooses compassion, and he chooses to care for them, and he heals every single person that comes to him. So this shows how Jesus' compassion is greater than our physical weakness, and that God's compassion is an active act. It's not static. God is constantly showing his compassion to us each and every day. Then in verse 15, it says, "Now when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, 'This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves.'" So now Jesus is done teaching. He's been preaching to these people, and it's the evening, and the disciples point out this logical issue that they need to go get food, right? Like, everyone's probably hungry. So they suggest that they should send everyone back out to the villages so they can go buy food. And I think this is a very natural reaction, right? Is to, when a problem arises or an issue arises, we just kind of push it off and ignore it. We say, "Oh, well, that's not our problem. They need to eat, so they need to go buy food," right? That's not our issue to deal with. However, in this next verse, Jesus is going to flip that on its head, and he's going to show why we should be participants and not spectators. So in verse 16 it says, "But Jesus said, 'They need not go away. You give them something to eat.'" So here, Jesus is commanding his disciples, and he's telling them exactly what they need to do. And, this is something we can look at and say that Jesus is telling us to do as well. We should be taking responsibility and going out and providing for people and serving people. Now, obviously, you don't have to go feed 5,000 people, but, there's small things you can do to serve people or to provide for somebody, whether it's buying somebody's lunch or donating clothes you don't wear, holding the door open for somebody, talking to a stranger, helping someone carry their groceries. Like, there's so many ways that you can provide for somebody in just small ways, and all it takes is a little bit of time and a little bit of effort. So I want to challenge everyone that's watching this video, this week, try and find something you can do every day to serve somebody. And again, it doesn't have to be anything big. It could just be something small, but just see how much of an impact that has, and, see how that makes you feel after serving somebody. So then in verse 17, it says, "They said to him, 'We have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish.'" So now the disciples are only looking at their physical resources. They only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. So obviously that's not enough to feed over 5,000 people. But they're forgetting that the literal Son of God and walking miracle is right next to them. So, when you're going to serve somebody, it can be scary. You can get nervous, offering to serve people. But just remember that God is always by your side when you're doing that, and he will give you the strength that you need to serve and provide for somebody. Sorry about that. I'm not feeling great if you can't tell, so my throat has been killing me, so I had to go get some water. So if we want to look at verses 18 through 19, "And he said, 'Bring them here to me.' Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds." So I think it's really cool how Jesus doesn't worry about the size of their offering, right? Jesus just takes what the disciples have to offer, and he makes do. Sorry. Even when we feel like we don't have a lot to offer or that we can't make a big impact, just know that God will use whatever we have to offer, and he'll multiply it, and he'll make it adequate. I also like how it's not Jesus that's giving out the bread, right? Jesus multiplies the offering and then he gives it to his disciples to give out. So it's the same way when we serve, right? We offer and we surrender our time and our effort. God multiplies it, and then we go out and use that and we serve people, right? Just like the disciples did here. So now if we look at verse 20, it says, "And they all ate and were satisfied, and they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over." So I think it's really cool how everyone was fully satisfied, right? Like everyone was full. No one was lacking. And it's the same way with God. When we offer our life up to God and we surrender our life to God, he fulfills us and he meets all of our needs, physical and spiritual. So I think it's a really good representation of what God does in our life, right? He doesn't just fill us halfway or part way, but he fills us all the way so that we aren't lacking. And it's so crazy to see how God can take such a small offering and multiply it into such a big thing, right? So this is honestly what this channel was meant for. That is why I named the channel after this story, because this is my offering, this is my surrender of my time and my effort, and this is my offering. And my prayer has been that God will use this offering and he'll multiply it and he'll reach all kinds of people and, hopefully change lives. And so now finally, if we want to look at verse 21, "And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children." So Jesus was able to reach over 5,000 people with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. So imagine how many people God can affect if you offer him your life, right? If you surrender to him your time and your effort. And again, this takes practice. You're not just going to be able to surrender fully all the way the first time. It takes practice. So I would say just surrender a little bit. Like I said, just have little acts of service, little acts of surrender of your time and your effort. Spend time in your Bible, spend time in prayer, spend time listening to worship music, spend time going to church. These are all just small things, small sacrifices, small surrenders that you can make in order to grow in your relationship with God, right? And so if you can surrender just a little bit, God can do huge things with that surrender. All right, guys, so that's going to wrap up the first episode on the Five Loaves channel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I also want to thank my good friend Sam Hill for letting me use his space to record this episode. I'm really excited to see how this channel is going to go and all the people that we can reach through it. Like I said, if you guys enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe and comment any ideas or topics that you want us to cover. And I'm really excited to see where this channel goes. Thank you again for watching.